Hi everybody, and welcome back to This Week in Magic Online Finance. I'm your host, Chaz Andres, and I've got some news for you today, which is that I'm on vacation, so I don't have any of the normal movers and shakers for you. Don't worry, I'll be back bright and early next Monday morning with all the latest on Goblin Chain Whirler and Karn Sign of Urza and Lyra Dawnbringer and all the other crazy things that have probably happened in Standard while I've been away. But for now, I've got another topic to discuss which I think is going to be well worth your time, and that is a guide to getting into Magic Online Vintage. One of my favorite parts of Magic Online is that you can actually play Vintage on it, unlike in Paper Magic where it's only a format for the absolute wealthiest people on Earth or people who have been hoarding cards since they were in diapers. If you take a look at the MTG Goldfish price averages for the top 3 decks in the format in Paper, they average out to $25,000 a deck. And that's up from $19,000 in December, so it's only getting crazier. 25 grand is the price of a brand new car, a fairly nice car, or like a down payment on a house. It's crazy to have that deck, but online, you can do it. So, how much do those top 3 vintage decks average out to on MTGO? About 500 tickets a deck. Now, granted, that's not a super bargain either. $500 is about a week's pay for a lot of us, but compared to $25,000, they're a bargain. You can buy 50 vintage decks on MTGO for the price of 1 vintage deck in Paper, so this is a format that is accessible for a lot of people in a way that Paper Vintage will never be. Now, if you haven't bought into any vintage on MTGO before, you probably think that the cards that are the most expensive are the same ones that make the format so inaccessible in Paper Magic. Cards like the Power 9. But the Power 9 are actually relatively cheap online. The cards that are expensive are the same ones that are expensive because they see a ton of play in Modern. Cards like Polluted Delta and Snapcaster Mage. So if you have these cards already for some reason, there's really no reason not to buy into Vintage. If you have a big Modern collection, you also coincidentally have about 80% of a Vintage collection. Let's start by talking about the Power 9 because, let's be honest, you are probably going to have to buy them if you want to play Vintage. These are restricted cards though, so you only need 1 copy of each. And really no decks run Time Twister, so we're really just talking about the Power 8. So how much are they going to be? Well, if you buy them at current retail, only about $86 for the entire set. And then you're done, you don't need to worry about power anymore. That's not much. And this is the historic low price for MTGO. They've never been lower in the entire history of the format. So not only could getting into Vintage be kind of a fun summer project, but you can probably flip them for a little bit more at some point if you want. There is another pretty major barrier to entry to Vintage though, and that is Force of Will. About 3/4 of all vintage decks run Force of Will, and unlike the Power 9, you're probably going to need to invest in a full playset here. Based on the current retail price of the card, that playset is going to run you about 150 tickets, which is a lot. So if that's the barrier for you, I get it, but if you can afford it, owning Force of Will is pretty sweet. It opens up a lot of legacy decks to you as well, and it's a fairly stable card. I have seen them about as low as 20 tickets each. That was back during the first part of 2017, but it was just reprinted in Vintage Masters, which didn't tank the price all that much, and I've seen it in the low to high 40s as well, so buying in now isn't awful. It's fine, actually. Beyond that, I highly recommend taking a look at your existing Modern and Legacy collection before choosing a Vintage deck. There's a lot of overlap, and if you can find a deck that overlaps with cards you already own, you're gonna be able to make it a whole lot cheaper. If you already have Arcbound Ravagers for Modern Affinity, then Vintage Workshops is going to be a lot cheaper for you. If you already have Mox Opals for Modern Lantern Control, you can check out Paradoxical Outcome. If you already have Cavern of Souls for Modern Humans, you can check out Vintage White Eldrazi. There's a bunch of decks like this where the most expensive cards other than Force of Will end up being overlaps to existing good decks in other formats. Don't forget that you don't have to maximize your mana base your first time out either. This is a trap that a lot of newer Vintage and Legacy players fall into, wanting to get that mana base to 100% efficiency before they've even played their deck. You don't have to do that. You can substitute some slightly lower percentage fetch lands, sub in some shock lands for some duels, and get playing. I'd maximize your deck before you drop too much on Vintage entry fees, but you can get going and get to 90th percentile mana for a lot less money than current retail if you're willing to compromise just a little bit. So what if you don't have a big Modern collection and you don't have a desire to buy the Power 9? Well, I recommend Vintage Dredge as one of the better budget opportunities in the format. It's still going to be about 220 tickets, but more than half of that money comes from the playset of Force of Wills that you need to run the deck. Beyond that, you're really only paying for cards like Bloodghast, which is about 9 tickets, and City of Brass, which is 3 or 4. Other than that, the deck is dirt cheap. This is really expensive in paper because of Bazaar of Baghdad, but online Bazaar of Baghdad is under a ticket, so it's a lot cheaper. Another cheaper option I kind of like right now is Storm. That one doesn't require Force of Will, but it does require the Power 9, which again is okay because the Power 9 is pretty cheap right now. You also need a Lion's Eye Diamond for that one, as well as some number of fetch lands and dual lands, but dual lands are also pretty close to their historic lows, due again to the Vintage Masters reprints in December, so it's a reasonable time to buy into Storm. That one is also under the 300 ticket mark. Now, what do you do if you decide, I don't just want to buy a single Vintage deck, I want to invest in Vintage, period? What do? Well, usually with a format like Modern, you'd want to buy a bunch of the cheaper stuff in case it spikes later on. Vintage, not so much like that. Remember that the Vintage market on MTGO is really small and the format has those major bottlenecks. Force of Will, and the Power 9. So what ends up happening is that the 2 to 3 ticket Vintage staples end up staying in that range for quite some time. It may seem like a shock to see a Bazaar of Baghdad in the 1 ticket range, but that is actually where it belongs relative to supply and demand. So don't go crazy with cards like that. Buy the cheaper ones that you need for your decks, and otherwise I'd invest in the bigger ticket staples. Things like the Power 9 and Force of Will. That said, there are several Vintage cards you may want to consider investing in if you do have some extra cash. It's not that these are great quick flip opportunities, it's more that they've been historically at higher prices, they're starting to creep up a bit, and they were low because of the Vintage Masters re-release in December, or the Iconic Masters release, or the Masters 25 release, or some combination of all three. For example, Demonic Tutor was a 9-ticket card back when Ixalan was released, and it dropped down to about 3, it's up to a little over 4 now and starting to rise again. You've got Flusterstorm, that's a card that dropped down to about 2 after Iconic Masters, it's up over 3 and starting to head back toward the 7 to 8 range. Then you've got Ancient Tomb, also about 3 tickets right now, and that's a card that usually kicks around in the 6 to 7 ticket range, so it's a little bit below where I think it'll end up as well. That's all I got for you this week. I'm Chaz Andres, and don't forget to join me next Monday morning. I'm back with the latest movers and shakers. We'll talk about Modern, we'll talk about Standard. I'll see you next week.